today, we're taking a deep dive into April Ajoy's really powerful and deeply personal book. It's called Star-Spangled Jesus, Leaving Christian Nationalism and Finding a True Faith.
Yeah, and our mission here is to really unpack Christian nationalism, but not from some detached academic view. We're looking through the unique lens of Ajoy's own journey. She grew up in this stuff. So we'll look at its core ideas, its history, which has some surprises, and the specific tactics it uses. And we'll see how she ended up finding a really different understanding of faith. The goal is to get you, our listener, really well informed, maybe challenge some assumptions too.
Okay, so to really get Ajoy's insights, we need to understand where she started, her roots. She said she was a conservative evangelical pretty much her whole life, grew up with a father who was a world-renowned traveling evangelist. So her identity early on just completely wrapped up in faith and politics. She even made a MySpace group called I'm a Christian, Therefore I'm a Republican, and later performed her own song, America Say Jesus, on national Christian TV. That's pretty deep immersion.
It really is. And what's fascinating is just how totally this shaped her view back then. At 19, she actually wrote a book arguing against liberal brainwash, the gay agenda, stuff like that, even against Christians who are too nice. She thought she was fighting for Jesus. It just shows how deep those connections between faith and political identity can get right from the start. It creates this really powerful life narrative.
And this is where it gets really interesting for her journey, what made her start to rethink things.
Yeah.
Ajoy points right at the January 6th Capitol attack. Now, lots of people were shocked by the violence, but she says she wasn't totally surprised. She'd seen plenty of rumblings inside conservative Christian Facebook groups, but seeing it unfold made her feel so disconnected from the people on that screen. She realized this was not a Christianity I'd ever followed.
That sounds like a huge turning point, a moment where her own faith, her understanding of it, just clashed head on with what she was seeing publicly. She says Republicanness was close to godliness for her. And a key insight from her book is how Christian nationalism often just hides in plain sight as regular old American Christianity. It subtly frames itself as the only true Christianity, which makes it super hard for people inside to even tell the difference.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What are the core beliefs, the tenets, that hold this ideology together according to Ajoy? The first one she flags is America is the best. She even talks about this Christian nationalism math. God plus America, greatest nation on earth. Simple as that.
Pretty much, yeah. And what's really insightful is how she looks back at scripture she knew well, like John 3.16, for God so loved the world. But in her upbringing, she says the world often felt America was God's unspoken favorite. It really shows how a universal message can get twisted, narrowed down when you filter it through that nationalistic lens. It stops being for everyone.
Okay, another big tenet she identifies is Christian evangelical. Ajoy explains that the Christian part in Christian nationalism today really just means the white evangelical sect of Christianity in America. Any other kind is just like mere Christianity, often in quotes, seen as false or heretical, maybe even laughable. She mentions being really sheltered from how diverse Christianity actually is. She only knew about 15 denominations when there are, over 45,000 globally? That's incredible insulation.
Right. This idea that there's only one right way to interpret everything, it's a huge theme for her. She even remembers her dad saying proudly from the pulpit, people call us narrow-minded. Maybe that's true, but we can afford to be because we're right. And she put that same feeling into her song, America Say Jesus. They say we're narrow-minded, but they can argue all they want because we know we're right. It's this real us versus them thing where, like, doubts were seen as weak. For wussies, it just shuts down any questioning.
Okay, third tenet, morality should be mandated. Now, Ajoy makes a distinction here between her father's way and today's Christian nationalism. Her dad, she says, was more like a St. Patrick type, believed in persuasion, converting people one by one. He wanted Christian leaders making decisions based on the Holy Spirit's guidance.
Yeah, and the contrast she draws is really stark. Persuasion versus force. Today's Christian nationalists, she argues, they see the best way forward as basically taking over the government and mandating morality. She points to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene openly saying, yeah, I'm a Christian nationalist, or Sean Fries saying, we want believers to be the ones writing the laws. Yes, guilty as charged. It really makes you ask, what gets lost spiritually or ethically when faith gets that tied up enforcing morality through government power?
It sounds like that phrase, God in control, starts meaning something very different. Less spiritual guidance, more political control.
That's exactly her point. She stresses that while God to be in control sounds good, sounds righteous, that is not the focus of today's Christian nationalism. It's much more about gaining political power by enforcing specific conservative ideals. Things like very strict laws on abortion or LGBTQ rights. And she contrasts that so sharply with what Jesus taught. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, the merciful. And she brings up Romans 12.2 about not being conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. It encourages thinking for yourself, discernment, not just being told what's right.
Okay, moving on from the tenets, Ajoy really gets into the history, and she shows how race is just, well, deeply embedded in Christian nationalism's foundations. She talks about her own church experiences like Racial Reconciliation Sunday with videos showing diversity, but then noticing that all of the pastoral team were white and most of them were men. Black people were around, she says, but never in the room where meaningful decisions are made.
Yeah, that insight into diversity as performance versus actual systemic racism, it's really crucial. And she exposes how the Bible itself was used to justify slavery. It's pretty shocking. Things like interpreting Noah's curse on Ham's descendants as applying to Africans, or using Ephesians 6.5, telling slaves to obey your earthly masters. And the most striking thing, slaveholding Christians literally made a slave Bible that just cut out the story of Moses leading the Israelites to freedom. It presented a version of Christianity that could maybe save your soul, but definitely wouldn't break your chains. It shows how institutions can look inclusive on the surface while the power structures stay the same.
And she draws this really strong and honestly quite disturbing a line connecting some of this to the Ku Klux Klan, pointing out their use of the burning cross and the American flag as symbols. She quotes actual KKK writings from 1920 saying things like, patriotism and Christianity are preeminently the moving principles of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and that the flag, Constitution, and Bible are keystones of Klan principles.
It is a sobering connection she makes. Now, she's careful. She's not saying they're identical today. But she is highlighting enough similarities to sound alarms about mixing national identity with one specific religious view. Her main point is that calling out the whiteness in Christian nationalism isn't reverse racism. It's about acknowledging this long history of calculated decisions to keep whiteness in power. When white Christians hold the power, she argues, they can't really fix systemic problems without giving up some of that power. It's about understanding where the power has historically resided.
The title itself, Star-Spangled Jesus, just screams that confusion of faith and nation. And she really develops this in the chapter In God We Trump, describing what she calls the wedding of evangelicals and Republicans.
Yeah, it's a really compelling story she tells. She traces how people like Phyllis Schlafly rallied women around family values, how James Dobson pushed for pro-family policies, Pat Robertson blurring church and state through media. But she says Jerry Falwell Sr. was the one who really officiated the wedding, making political action feel like a Christian requirement. So this movement was building for a long time, but for her personally, the big shock seemed to be Jerry Falwell Jr. endorsing Donald Trump.
She says she was shocked at how my fellow evangelicals embraced Trump as if he were one of us. That's where the tension really seemed to spike for her.
Exactly. She describes Trump as this reality TV star who just seemed so immoral, multiple affairs, foul language, rarely went to church, all that stuff. Yet the evangelical support just never wavered. And that really made her start asking questions like, does being a Christian really mean you have to vote Republican? The excuses she heard, oh, he's just a baby Christian, or we're not electing a pastor, they just weren't holding water for her anymore. And that's where she saw this huge shift from valuing maybe strong Christian character to accepting what one conservative pundit, Megan Basham, actually called effective hypocrisy. Basham tweeted something like, I don't especially care if a politician is sincere. I'll take effective hypocrisy over ineffective sincerity any day. It really shows a shift towards valuing political results above everything else.
Okay, so we've looked at the beliefs, the history. Now, Ajoy digs into something maybe even more revealing. How does this ideology keep its hold? How does it grow? She outlines these really powerful tactics, starting with how Christian nationalism controls information and builds distrust.
Right. She talks about growing up thinking there were basically two kinds of media, the good, inspiring Christian media, and then everything else, which was demonic, secular media. And her time working at CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network, really drove this home. They'd focus only on stories of complete healings, for example, and actively avoid stories that didn't fit the narrative, stories of ex-gay people who later came out as queer. This creates this false message, she says, and leads people to think every outside narrative is a lie, which leads right to shouting, fake news. This siloing makes the approved media the ultimate authority, the ultimate source of truth, sometimes even more trusted than pastors or family. She points to a CBS poll showing Trump was the most trusted source for his supporters. And this control over information, she argues, feeds directly into conspiracy theories.
And she admits she believes some of them herself, like MTV was trying to join the kids of my generation gay, Or the whole Obama birther conspiracy.
Yeah. And it raises that question, doesn't it? How easily just a small hint of a conspiracy can grab hold, especially when people feel uncertain or scared. She gives the example of the COVID vaccine being called the mark of the beast. And the appeal of these theories, even the really wild ones, is that the more complicated the theory, the less likely you are to trust anyone else. Every voice disagreeing just becomes part of the enemy. It effectively traps people in this echo chamber.
It definitely sounds like a lot of these tactics play on fear, creating this strong sense of us being under attack by them. How does Ajoy show Christian nationalism using fear, demonizing others, even boycotts?
Oh, it's a really central strategy. She talks about internal fear-mongering, especially the fear of hell. She remembers being told at just 3 years old, if a little prayer is all it takes to avoid eternal damnation, then it makes complete sense to just say it, just in case. And this fear gets used politically. Figures like Franklin Graham linking voting biblically to basically avoiding hell. This fear then fuels the demonizing enemies part. Her own experience at a Black Lives Matter protest is a stark example. She's a lifelong Christian, right? But she and her mom get screamed at, cussed out, flipped off, called Antifa, Marxist, communist with zero evidence. The logic becomes, as she puts it, the eternal ends justified the bullying means. And this extends to boycotts, too. Boycotting woke companies becomes a form of spiritual warfare. It lets them use the free market, she says, to make our enemies pay without government interference.
And this ties into what she calls the persecution complex, right? Where any pushback against Christian values is framed as an attack used to rally people.
Absolutely. It's a super effective tactic because it deflects any real accountability. She mentions Judge Roy Moore, the one removed for refusing to take down the Ten Commandments monument. He became a hero of the faith. His supposed persecution just boosted his standing. The argument becomes, our rights as Christians are under attack if gay people can marry or if churches face restrictions during a pandemic. It creates this weird cycle where the more pushback and hate a bill receives, the more it's celebrated because of the persecution it generates.
Okay, then there are the really specific social issues,
Yeah.
the front lines. Let's touch on guns, violence, and other Christian things. She grew up with guns, hunting, believing the Second Amendment was basically sacred.
Yeah, and it forces you to ask how faith gets reconciled with violence. She mentions the common phrase, I'm in the Lord's army, the support for wars. For her, a turning point was Sandy Hook, the school shooting in 2012. That's when she says she started to wonder if there were cases when maybe it might not be the worst thing to limit access to military-style weapons. And now, she says, some Christian nationalists even complain if sermons mention liberal talking points like turn the other cheek. They see it as weak.
Wow. And then, of course, abortion, another huge battleground. She talks about being given a little rubbery fetus as a kid, the absolute belief that if you were a Christian, you were pro-life, period.
But what's really striking is her journey towards a more nuanced view. She remembers a college discussion, imagining herself facing an unplanned pregnancy and realizing the church's pro-life stance often just turned into shame for unwed mothers. She actually went back to the Bible, looking at Exodus 21, which talks about a fine if you cause a miscarriage, but the death penalty if you kill the mother. That suggested to her maybe the mother's life was valued more in that context. She ends up concluding the Bible is actually ambiguous on it, not a clear condemnation. And the shift led her to become, in her words, pro-all life, caring about mothers, kids after birth, immigrants, people on death row, victims of gun violence.
Finally, what about education? How does Christian nationalism try to shape that? She mentions being homeschooled or in Christian schools where evolution was just a theory, but young earth creationism was taught as fact.
Right, it shows how controlling the information starts really young. But interestingly, even in Christian colleges, she had professors who challenged her. A sociology professor who completely rocked my world just by saying it was okay to ask questions. And a Bible professor who suggested you could actually believe in evolution and the Bible simultaneously, maybe even the Big Bang Theory. Just being exposed to different ideas, having permission to question, that's what eventually led her out of her nationalist beliefs. It makes you think, maybe it's not indoctrination after all, and just learning. The power of simply learning and thinking critically.
So April Ajoy wraps up her book talking about her personal journey out of all this. She calls it debilitating, isolating, but also life-changing.
Yeah, it's such a powerful ending. She really emphasizes how deep these beliefs go, that no one chooses to do it. It just happens. Her big decision was just to stop looking away from uncomfortable truths, to actually listen to different kinds of people, consider ideas outside her usual evangelical bubble. And it cost her lost relationships, social standing, jobs. but she says she found a truer faith. She describes the process so vividly. I had to take everything apart. I didn't know which parts of my beliefs were true to the faith versus what was a Christian nationalist belief. Something in the foundation was rotten, and the only way to find it was to tear it all down and start over. It really highlights the immense courage it takes to question the very foundation of your life and community.
Wow. April Ajoy's Star-Spangled Jesus is definitely a remarkable story. Deconstruction, rediscovery, gives us so much to think about. So what does her journey mean for you, the listener, navigating this world with all its conflicting messages?
I think her journey really underscores just how much courage it takes to question things you've held dear, especially when they define your whole world, your community. It really highlights the power of, well, empathy, critical thinking, and just being willing to genuinely listen to people outside your own bubble. It's a call to look at our own foundations, isn't it? And ask if they really line up with the values we say we hold.
So what's the takeaway then? What does this all mean for you, reflecting on this deep dive?
I think Ajoy's experience really challenges us all, doesn't it? In a world where so many people, so many forces are trying to tell us what to believe and why. How do we build a faith or even just a worldview that's actually rooted in compassion and asking hard questions and having an expansive love for all people instead of one built on fear or exclusion or just demanding everyone follow one narrow interpretation? It's really a powerful invitation, I think, to keep examining what we believe and why.